Hi folks. My name's Matt Buckland, and I'm the Visitor Operations Manager in Loch Lomond, the Trossachs National Park. I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of one particular area of the national park today, and that's East Loch Lomond, because I think some of the experiences that you may be having in Wasdale might have some similarities to this particular area. So just to give you a little bit of an idea, I suppose, of the area itself. So what we're talking about here is effectively a road that runs along the east side of Loch Lomond. It's a single road in and a single road out of about 10 miles. We've got visitor car parks along there, four of them, two formal campsites, one informal campsite, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Ferry over to Island of Inchcarloch, a visitor centre, which regularly on a Saturday sees about 800 people, but we can see double that on a very, very busy day through the doors. We've got the long distance path, the West Highland Way, running along there. Access from those car parks I mentioned to Shingle Beaches, two very popular hills. So we've got Conic Hill, which is 361 meters, and that really is very, very busy. It's like the one of those key small hills in the park that people visit. And then we've got Ben Lomond, that's right down the end of the route at Rowan, and that has over 50,000 people visiting it, and that's our most southerly Monroe at 974 meters. In terms of facilities, with toilets at some of those car parks that I've mentioned. And then in terms of private businesses, right down the end, there's a hotel, and then at Balmahar, which is one of the sort of the main stops along the way, there's an inn and a shop, and the business there is expanded quite greatly. So you can kind of get a bit of a picture of what we've got. So in terms of visitor behaviours, loads of similarities with Tony, so we're not going to sort of go over those. So I think, in terms of reassurance there, that people are sort of, have similar behaviours, and exactly the 10%, 90%, all of those sorts of things that Tony said and Neil's alluded to, absolutely agree. That's very similar. So I suppose with East Loch Lomond, this is an area of the national park that's experienced visitor pressures for a number of years, way before COVID. So I think what I'll do is I'll give you an idea of some of the different things that happened in the first, or in what I call the first phase of East Loch Lomond from a visitor management perspective, and then or how things progressed in a cycle. So um, thinking about the problems, so some of the behaviours that Tony has talked about, but this is before my time. But when I see some of the photographs, some of them are truly horrific. So not only is there the huge amounts of litter, there was quite a lot of partying behaviour, and that spilled over into violence. So there actually were quite a few different violent instances along there, burnt out cars and things like that. Which, to be honest, if you see the sites today, you really wouldn't think that would be the case, but it was. So you ended up with this area that there was still a huge amount of pressures on, and it was also putting other visitors off. So it started to have a bit of a reputation of a bit of a no-go area. So before my time, to sort of try and tackle that, there were a few different things that people put together. So there was a visitor management plan that was put together, and that was sort of centered around a group which had community representatives on it, business reps, National Park, Police Scotland, all of those people on it, and various different actions came from that. One of them was a camping bylaw, and that came in 2011, and that was only focused on East Loch Lomond, and that was pretty much a no camping, in terms of in terms of what you've mentioned as fly camping or informal camping, or car camping. But that to sort of balance that removal, we worked with Forestry and Land Scotland at the time, and they put in what we call an informal campsite. So an informal campsite is very much uh, a bit of land, a bit of grass, a very simple toilet block, and in line with the Scottish Outdoor Access Code, we'll have a limitations of a 3-night stay. So there won't be any showers or anything like that. So it's kind of like your most basic campsite, and at quite a low cost. So it was effectively giving something back to say, look, yeah, we understand that low cost camping, this kind of informal camping is something people want, but that was sort of an alternative that was put in. At the same time as the camping bylaws went in, we worked with the local authority, and alcohol bylaws went in. And depending on who you speak to that was around at the time, um, some people might say that the alcohol bylaws had more of an impact than the actual camping bylaws themselves, but together, with the different facilities, they definitely did have an impact. And then the other thing that kind of came about at that sort of same time, and this kind of covered the whole national park, was the introduction of a national park police officer being seconded to the national park. And at the time, there was additional money that went to police overtime. But that's kind of rolled back now, and we've still got our national park police officer. So that's really useful because we have different police divisions across the national park. So partly you've got the officer actually out and about supporting rangers, and doing particular operations that the main police force wouldn't have the time or the opportunity to do. So that could be do things like Operation Close Pass, which is looking at cycle safety, things like Lose the Blinkers, which is equestrian safety, and those sorts of things, and targeted operations to do with visitor management, and community safety within the park. So that's kind of some of those interventions. So there's a lot more to it than that, but effectively what happened is the people that were maybe put off by the partying behavior and some of those violent offences and things like that I mentioned, that changed. And phase two, it became a victim of its own success. So then you've got effectively really lovely area. Businesses started investing in it, felt confident with that. Lots of money went into that, especially around Balmaha. Lots and lots of people, pretty good behavior, all in all, but effectively too many people and traffic is the biggest issue that came from that. And I think, that sort of built up to the point where COVID kind of exacerbated everything, and sort of and that was sort of a bit of a tipping point, if you like, and made us have to look again. um, we did, in 2017, before COVID, we introduced camping management bylaws a bit more widely. So the ones that I mentioned there, they were just specifically for Loch Lomond, but we did introduce camping bylaws in 2017 that covered a much wider area. Um, that was a massive decision for the national park. That was probably one of the biggest decisions in terms of visitor management that the national park had. We really did need to think about the proportionality of that. We also had to introduce certain things. So we introduced two additional campsites in the national park that were put in for that. We also introduced a permit scheme. And to this day, it's a huge amount of resource for our rangers to manage that. So it was a big decision for the park at the time, and we still think it probably is the right decision, but it was a massive, I just can't put into us how big a bigger decision it was. And the thing that it did really, really depend on a part of things that tipped us actually doing it. And the reason we went ahead with it is, one, it was providing those facilities. So it wasn't a camping ban everywhere. It was, providing these 300 spaces, permit areas that we had to manage effectively, like mini informal campsites all over the park. But we also had a huge amount of data. And I think, that is one of the things that was really important, before we went ahead with that, all of these other interventions that I've kind of mentioned, and that the kind of interventions that Tony and Neil have mentioned, they're really important, so the bylaws are kind of almost a last resort, if you like, in terms of an intervention. I mean, there was a lot of changes for the way that staff work. So, a lot of rangers maybe felt uncomfortable with the bylaws. So they've been giving messages and having educational conversations with people for years and years. But it's very different to go from that to actually, potentially having to caution and charge someone, under an offence. So that took quite a lot of different training, and still does require training on a yearly basis. The other thing I think that we started to do the kind of interventions during the COVID, a lot more around alternative destination development. And I suppose one of the things that that we try and get across, if you're gonna do any sort of management intervention in an area, is what is that impact going to have on other areas? So are you going to displace problems? So there's a big difference for us in whether we're going to actively disperse people and say, this is maybe a place that you could visit if you want that similar experience, to not having that sort of active thought process and just people just spilling out into another valley to cause some other people problems. And that's kind of one of the biggest considerations when we're looking at any sort of management intervention. We use things like variable messaging signage. We had live car park updates during that time, which were all done with volunteers. Um, and then we started to look again at infrastructure. And under that time, there were two lots of studies really that we started. So we started to look at what we called strategic tourism infrastructure design studies, really snappy title. And they looked at the existing car parks, how they actually worked for people. Were there enough facilities? Were there enough toilets, parking spaces? Were the flow of the car park safe? All of those different things. And then alongside that, transport study, which highlighted the need for public transport and a shift, a modal shift away from car use to public transport. So that's kind of like that was the COVID bit and phase two, where we still are now in that, you know, place where not quite as busy as it was during COVID, but still visitor numbers growing slowly every year. And I suppose the kind of things that we're thinking now from an intervention point of view is the transport that I've mentioned. So looking to work on things like shuttle buses, which is, I understand that the Lakes has already gone down that route, which is interesting. Also for us with Loch Lomond, they're using the loch and water transport, water taxis. So that's sort of an element, and even considering, and we've not got there yet, things like effectively a rural park and ride for East Loch Lomond and limiting traffic on the road at certain times. How will happen, really complicated, especially with the businesses down there. There's always that balance really of what the impact would be on businesses and local communities from those sorts of interventions. The investment and the sites that I mentioned, that's sort of now a rolling program of investment. A lot of that is future proofing, so future proofing for shuttle buses. So now, making it less focused around the car, more around the people, and again, like I say, how they interact with the site, and future spacing of, right, okay, if we're going to have a bus in the future, where will that go? How will that work? So really focusing on that side of things. The bins element, I agree with these two gentlemen. We have a bins in some places, but not others. So right down at the end of the road that I mentioned, Brower Denham, we don't have any bins down there. We have bins in places where we know we can manage them, and at Balmoral we have some bins because there's cafes there and things like that, and it's right outside our visitor centre, and we can manage them. But right down at the other end, we don't, and we encourage people to take their rubbish home with them. We're looking in terms of policy of people bringing stuff with them. We're looking again at kind of encouraging hire, not bring. And that's, means there's more opportunities, hopefully, for businesses to pop up for hiring bikes and hiring paddle boards or all of those sorts of elements, rather than people bringing everything with them and then needing to have their cars. And then the other element, I suppose, is investments in technology. So again, quite new to us. There's things like visitor-facing maps that can show live car park information, where's busy, where's not, predictive elements of, right, at this particular time of year, this is a very busy place, but you can look on the map and say, oh, actually, there's an alternative there. We'll go to Keswick today and go around Derwent Water or something like that. So that's one element of that. And that particular tool that I'm talking about, actually, that's the front-facing element of it. The rear-facing element comes to us and to the rangers, so we can see, where the hotspots are, and that might mean that we can see, okay, there's lots of activity building up in Wasdale, so it'll be worth sending someone down there. But actually we'll look at it and say, oh, there's not a lot of people, so we can have a bit more of an intelligent deployment of staff. So that's kind of quite new to us, and we're still sort of in a bit of a testing phase with that sort of technology. We also have volunteers. Our volunteer rangers are a massive part of what we do, so they're out doing patrols. They don't do any of the enforcement element of stuff, but they do share information with with our full-time rangers and link back to us. And I think, we've got a couple of other things coming up, like visitor levy that's coming up for us in Scotland, which might give a potential income stream from businesses that could then be fed into things like the shuttle buses and some of these visitor management interventions. I suppose the one thing I suppose that I like risk, and it's something that kind of brings to my mind, especially as we come into East Loch Lomond, this next phase, is all of these interventions that you do, there's always that risk of risk to the landscape and the potential for urbanization. And I think in some of the interventions that I've seen across the country, especially that happened during COVID, and again, I wouldn't blame these managers at all because they really were up against it. But you've ended up with some really quite extreme and maybe not proportionate, you know, uh, hard investments in places that where car parks that are maybe more urban than they should be, et cetera, et cetera. And trying to accommodate numbers rather than saying no, actually, this is way over the carrying capacity. So those kind of things are the kind of things we're thinking about at the moment, working on at the moment, and those kind of things we're grappling with. So I hope that was all right, folks, but that was just a bit of a whistle stop tour. But yeah.